Hello and welcome to the next episode. Now, this time we are going to look at infrastructure. Finally, I have talked about so much already and we touched infrastructure so many times, but it deserves its own episode because it's a very nice, deep, and complicated system. So, all the things we want. And let's start with Aden itself again as our capital here in our Yemen run and look at what we got here. So, basically, there are 6 kind of infrastructures, which are the highlighted by these numbers here, as we can see. So we have a capital infrastructure, we have amenities infrastructure, we have garrison infrastructure, we have pathing infrastructure, we have irrigation infrastructure, and we have harborage infrastructure. Now, there are three infrastructures which are city dependent. So basically you can only have capitals, amenities, and harborages if you have residents there. Because you need residents, so urban labor, to build these infrastructures. So everything you see here has to be built by your population and it has to be paid. So you have to pay the labor and you have to pay the resources to construct it. Therefore, to get higher levels of infrastructure, you need to upgrade it. And you have to pay for this as a state, or if you are lucky, your estates pay for parts of it by building what they like. So for example, there currently is a project ongoing here in Sada, and Sada is currently building irrigations. It's nothing I did. It's the estates and the population in this province which decided, we don't know what to do with our money, so let's build better irrigation infrastructure. And they are slowly building this one up to finally get an upgrade here. And the irrigation infrastructure, for example, boosts your crop and fiber industries and certain parts of the exotic industries, like cash crops, for example. So for example, if we look at the industries here, what do we have here? We have crop here, we have dates. These two industries would get a boost from the better irrigation. The pasture and the nomadism would not get a boost from the irrigation. This would lead later on so that maybe the nomadism and the pasture will shrink and the others will grow because they are much more efficient, much more profitable, and therefore maybe outcompete the other ones. Maybe. But in the end, we profit from this anyway. Now, all the infrastructures you have in your province will give you something. For example, the harborages are of course all around naval stuff. You get force limit for fleet there from the burghers and the residents that are in this province. You have an impact on your communication efficiency from the harborages. The higher the level, the better it is. You get certain boosts to your shipbuilding industry by increases to the woodworking skills, so they are more efficient. You get more fisheries because you have a harbor which they can use and therefore they can work more efficient. But most importantly, you also get a commerce output so that trade is better done, which also has an impact on your burghers, which increases their population caps basically. And it also reduces costs for your trade because you have a harbor infrastructure present, which you need to pay independently, but make it cheaper for your burghers to trade goods on the global market, basically, or in your national market, wherever you trade. And that's basically the harborages. The irrigations are as already mentioned, impact your industries like crop, food, therefore, most important, food. Your garrisons provide you with port levels and defense, so they basically just make your province safer, which protects you against unrest, for example, or rebellions. So local unrest is reduced, for example, by garrisons, but also provides you with a fort level. Pathings, as already mentioned in the last episode, has an impact on the communication efficiency as well. It reduces the penalties from the terrain in these provinces. So for example, if you have to go through a mountain province, getting a road is very important because it reduces the penalties you get significantly. While on the other hand, for example, if you have a province which is just flat grassland, which is the best you can get, then building higher levels of roads isn't really doing much because you can already speed run with your horse through it. So a road won't do much there, except maybe you have somewhere you have an inn where you can sleep, for example. But in a mountainous province, having decent roads is critical. And then you have amenities, which is basically the infrastructure for your cities itself. So they determine how many residents you can house in your cities. If you are below the cap or above the cap, these amenities provide, your population will shrink or die out, basically, because you really have concerns like sanitary concern or not enough housing and so on. The capital, the last infrastructure to talk about, is something is particularly well for your main capital. So you basically consider it as a palace or your administration building. And this one will provide you with communication efficiency bonuses as well, because it will give you global improvements, but it will also give you centralization and more prestige if you have a high one. They are very, very expensive to make. You can also build them not in your capital. If you do build them somewhere else, you will have something like a localized point of where you can reduce your communication efficiency from. So for example, if we were to build one here in Muscat, for example, what would happen here is that the communication efficiency going to Muscat is reduced, and then communication efficiencies going from Muscat to other provinces is reduced as well, depending on the capital in this province. Which means that if you have certain points on your map which are very critical for your communication efficiency, then building capitals there is quite useful. To explain this, for example, if you are, let's say, what is a good example? Where's a good example? Let's take Poland, Lithuania here. Poland, Lithuania, the capital is relatively far in the west here, in Krakow or in Warsaw, depending on where you moved it or where the AI moved it to. So you maybe long-term have a capital infrastructure here, therefore reducing your global communication efficiency. However, if you have integrated Lithuania, the path to the east is very far. And even if you build roads everywhere, this will be a problem. So for example, what you maybe want to do is, if you check out the river network again, you can see that there is the western river network in Poland, where Warsaw and Krakow is on. So it's this blue color here. These are covered by basically your local harborages and your local capital. But then you maybe want to have a capital infrastructure in one of the provinces here, which is, for example, Kiev itself. So, for example, you could try to connect here into this river network by doing some pathings in between harborages in these provinces to get, like, okay, you walk by land to here, then you get on a ship, and then you run to Kiev. And then you make a new capital infrastructure here in Kiev, which then can communicate with the southern parts of, like, the Crimea and all eastern parts of Lithuania, so they can be more efficient again. So you basically create a new hub of communication efficiency by using these capitals. Very important late game infrastructure, very expensive to make, so nothing for anything early game. However, it is to a certain degree connected to the institution of meritocracy here. So if you want to remake it, you will need government reforms, and one of these reforms will need you to have a level 3 capital infrastructure in your capital. So basically, you need to get this to level 3 if you ever want to get meritocracy invented at any point in this game. But it's, as said, that's more of a late game problem. Now, infrastructure, as we already mentioned, every province has its own. For example, Sana doesn't have a harborage because it doesn't have a river or is not coastal. And it has a different setup of infrastructures here. Same for all the other provinces here. For example, this one, this desert province, doesn't have anything. If we want to upgrade the infrastructures here, which has to be paid by the state unless the estates build it on their own. It can be done on two things, in two ways, basically. So one way is that we use the mark system, which is basically select province here. I have already, I've currently set it to individual selections here. And I can clear my selection again here. So removing this red pin here. I could do this and do it with decisions to, for example, build infrastructure here. And then I could say, okay, I want to build here harborage level 7. Let's just for fun. I can't. Wait a second. Yeah, we have too many projects ongoing here, so we can't use Aiden as an example. Let's take Sana as an example. Sana only has one project ongoing, so we can build something here. Okay, let's build... Of course, we can't build a harborage here because we don't have anything. So let's build amenities level 7, for example. This will cost us 13,000 money. Yeah, that's nothing we want to do. So let's pick a realistic project. Let's build irrigation level 2. Irrigation level 2. Upgrade the one we got. That's almost 1,000 ducats to build 13 units of irrigation to get us to level 2. How many units irrigations you need depends on how much farmland you actually have in this province. So for example, this one has 526 farmland, so it's a lot more expensive than, for example, a province which only has 100 farmland. So that scales with that. Amenities, capitals, and harborages do not scale with the size of the province or with the size of one of the properties in there, like farmland. But for example, pathings and garrisons and irrigations are related to the size of the province or how much farmland is in there. Because it's of course more complicated to build roads in a massive province than in a very small one. Now, we would need to pay this amount of money to build the irrigation here. It also tells us that we need 3 peasantry labor per unit. Sadly, it doesn't tell us which goods it needs. That's something we might add here soonish. So basically telling you, okay, the cost depends on the peasantry labor. And I can also tell you, because we can see it here in the upkeep per maintenance upkeep, that we also need raw timber for this to build. So that's related to this. So basically the 1,000 money we have to pay here are raw timber and the labor of the peasantry, which has to be invested into upgrading this thing here. And then this would get constructed here. It would take some years to finish. And then we have an irrigation level 2 here, which makes our rural infrastructure or our crop industries much more profitable than they already are. And now I can directly tell you that infrastructure is extremely expensive. So you will not be building much early game. Later on, when you're reforming your tax income and your state actually gets more control over your provinces, then your incomes will go up significantly. So for example, now we have an income of 56. So investing into irrigation level 2 here would cost us about 20 months of income here. It's still a lot, but we do make a lot more projects as a state this way. Of course, 1,000 is a relatively big project on a big province. But for example, if we were to build like smaller harborages here on the coastlines, this is like 200, 300 ducats, for example. So much cheaper. And that way you can influence your communication efficiency, for example, or build up small towns if you really want to. Now, one way is to do it as I just showed. So doing with the localized select province. But you also have the macro builder here, which will be under buildings. You have these icons here. So for example, we can do the same again. Here is upgrade irrigations. So we can go to Sana, click here. Then we wait a short time. Oh, we got some events here. And after like 7 days or 10 days, we get an event. And we can now upgrade to level 2 here. Okay, we are 1st of February. And then we get... it changed a little bit between the months because probably the labor or the prices updated on the 1st of February. So we are back on the same thing here. The benefit of the macro builder basically is that if you want to, we could, for example, say, okay, we want to pick these three provinces here and then build irrigations to level 2 there. So we wait 10 days or 7 days. I'm not sure what it is exactly. Maybe a bit more. And then we pick level 2 here again. And then we see that this is, of course, in total a lot more. But we could build this here in these provinces. And that way you can, for example, relatively easily make sure, for example, we want to make sure that our main harbors here, like this one, this one, this one, and Benadi here. So we want to make sure that they are all at least on level 3. So let's wait for the event. And then we pick Harborage level 3. There we go. So tier 3. And then we see, okay, there is some harbor is not on level 3. It would cost us 1,500 ducats to get them to level 3 at least. We know that Aden is at level 5, so they will not invest anything. But let's see who is actually not at level 3. Come on. This one is at level 3, but probably do for... Yeah, it's only at level 2. And this one is level 3. So basically it's upgrading Dufa, which is the cost point here. But basically you can do this with the macro builder a little bit more detailed if you don't want to click through all provinces and pick them manually in their province UI. And yeah, so basically you can use this one as well. It also has the investment into properties in here, which is something you probably discovered. But basically, if you want to boost your industries, you can invest manually in them from the macro builder here, if you do not use the automatic investment for the moment. So basically, this is like micromanaging your industries and properties this way. What makes sense, for example, is to invest into commercial industries quite a lot. Yeah, and that's more or less the infrastructure. You can see the stuff it needs here, at least the goods you can see from the maintenance here. So for example, the lighthouse here, the harborage infrastructure requires naval and industry as goods. Irrigation needs raw and timber. The garrisons require industrial and military. And the amenities require industrial and knowledge. And the capital, for example, requires industrial and knowledge. Now you will notice that only the irrigation and the capital have actually a labor upkeep. That's intentionally. So basically these infrastructures here do not need labor to maintain them. Pathings also need a little bit of labor. So 3 industries, 3 infrastructures need a little bit of labor, and the others are without labor upkeep cost. And yeah, and from there, but of course, to make them, to upgrade them, you will need labor always to make them. So this is the difference between upkeep cost and maintenance cost and construction cost, basically. But the construction will also require the same goods that are used in the maintenance here, in this case. Now, continuing down the infrastructure path here, basically, to finish up everything in this chapter here before we dive into the next episode, which will be like some deeper thoughts on everything we have done in this chapter about economy. You can use the property tab here. And if you go to page 4, then you will see the infrastructure. And you will, for example, see here in Aden that our amenities at 136 of 180. Which means that to get to level 6, we would need to build, now math it out, 44 units of amenities to get it upgraded. Now I have to say that the amenities are a small exception here, that every unit you build of amenities will increase your cap of a residence already. So for example, as we can see here, we are currently at 536,000 residence cap. The ideal value at least, which will go up with every unit you build. So you don't necessarily need to get everything upgraded. But for example, as we can see here, we are very far above the cap. We are basically halfway there with our current population. So we don't need to build amenities here. But for example, if we look at the irrigation here, we would see that we need to construct 11 units to get the next level. But for example, we need to make only 2 units of capital to get the next upgrade. And that's something we are currently constructing. So we are making harbораges, amenities, and capitals here currently. Capitals is actually, I'm going to level 3 here currently with the project we are doing. So we invested a lot of money to start this project up. But basically, you can see this. You can also see the total demand of goods that are needed to keep your infrastructure alive. So for example, for this province, we need 0.4 for raw, 0.6 timber, 0.3 military, 1.5 naval, and 6.2 industrial, and 3.8 knowledge, just to keep the infrastructure running. And this is something your population or your state has to pay for. Currently, as we can see in the infrastructure fund at the top, we have a 4,550 infrastructure fund from everywhere. So it's basically piled up over time, which is basically the estates and the populations are paying into this fund. If it goes too far, or I mean it goes too far up this fund, then it will get invested into upgrades depending on what estate wants what. So for example, as we saw in Sana, where they were building irrigations. Now we can see here that the class investments are 309 and the state investment is 44. And we are spending 1,200 actually on maintenance in total. So there is a discrepancy, but in the end there will be more investments coming in from the estates to cover what is in between or what is missing currently. You can influence that if you want to. For example, what we can see here, it's in the bottom row, we can see that there is some small arrow. We can see that we are paying a small state fishery maintenance and we are paying a low state academic maintenance. So we are basically paying for the academic property, which is not an infrastructure, but it's the academic district where the higher learning is happening. We are paying this to not decay so that it stays the same. If we were not paying these kind of maintenances, so currently we are not paying much here, we could increase that if we want to, then our ownership will decrease over time because we are getting bought out by the estates. So for example, we are not paying any state maintenance. On commercials, we are not paying anything on the agriculture, we are not paying anything on the forestry here. We are only paying a small amount on the fishery. Yeah, and housing doesn't exist currently. So that's basically infrastructure here. A very complex system and something you can really have fun with micromanaging. I definitely recommend to, for example, play a river campaign. For example, Hungary here, or Poland, Lithuania, or Bohemia even, which are sitting on these massive river networks here. You can really have a lot of fun of connecting these provinces to each other with harbораges. For example, if you have your capital here in Pest, you can build this up and then you can build another city here. And then these two will directly communicate with each other. And because it's a river, it's super efficient. So you can really have nice low autonomy realms, even though you expanded, for example, heavily here into the Balkans as Hungary. It's quite a lot of fun to do. While, for example, Spain, you will really need to pay attention where to build pathings because they are super expensive. And the terrain, to be honest, in Spain is terrible. So that's simple terrain here. We can see here that we, for example, have forest highlands. We have wooded hills. We have wooded highlands. We have wooded highlands. We have wooded highlands here. Everything is terrible. Wooded mountains even. So Spain suffers from terrain. You really need a lot of pathings to get your autonomy properly done. So Spain did a good job here already, as you can see here. So, but they of course have like pathing 2 here, pathing 2 basically, yeah, in these main provinces, everything has pathing 2. This one doesn't have one, but there are a lot which have 1 or 2. And you really need to get this going to even have a decent chance of communication here in Spain. And therefore autonomy. one last thing about autonomy and everything related to infrastructure as well is that if you build up your infrastructure as well and therefore your autonomy goes down and everything else is managed, your culture also depends on this one. So for example, if you have low autonomies here, then your culture will spread more quickly. For my Yemen campaign, this is not really a topic, but for example, if you play the Ottomans here, you really want to spread your culture here. So you want to have low autonomies, so you need roads, inwards here, and harborages here to spread everything quickly. Yeah, and that's it for infrastructure. And next, we are going to do a last episode in the economy department about some minor things and some additional information which can be useful. So see you there.